two, three. Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack. I don't care if I ever get back. Oh, it's root for the Cubbies. If they don't win, it's a shame. For it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game. Hey!
This is
the Monday Morning Quarterback on the 27th of May, 2019. Happy Memorial Day to those out there in the U.S. that observe the day. We had special programming on 2019. You can find it at the usual locations on Twitter, on YouTube, Boston Red. You can find it there. iHeart, Stitcher. Stitcher does a magnificent job. A mobile platform, Alexa, the smart speaker platform, also the Google version and other versions there by just simply saying Boston Red. We have Numbers Man, the economic program that comes from the macro side. It's also on iHeart and the other channels. And we are improving how we produce things. We're working on that. This is Boston Red from the Jerry Pippin broadcast booth. We always honor Jerry Pippin on the Monday Morning Quarterback. We have a range of things here today from Charlie Cook. We'll call upon him. We won't do the talk shows today. What is happening in Florida with the DJ Trump re-election effort there in Florida. On sport, we'll look at the Bruins, what the Bruins are doing, what the Blues are doing in terms of their teams. We're not obviously as acquainted with hockey as baseball. We'll do our best. Soccer scores. The Women's Softball World Series. What the lineups are, who is in, who is out there. And we'll also look at agriculture, particularly sustainable agriculture, and the participation of African Americans, Latinos, and generally people of color and women in an organization called the FAA, who used to call themselves the Future Farmers of America. They were literally combined by fiat, by government regulations with the National Farmers Association there, and we'll talk about that. Very similar to what happened in Major League Baseball. There was a parallel African-American organization there that educated youth through high school programs, such as these so-called Future Farmers. But the Future Farmers was a European organization, and it is still a European organization, a member of the queer movement, brings about the history there, and he has written an essay which is on the FAA website. We'll look at it a bit there, and why he has talked about more diversity in the organization. As many people are aware, agriculture is very different today. The emphasis is very different. It's about, that organization is a split between people that are actually in farming and people that are not in farming, almost 50-50. Because today you have farming, yes, but you have people in rural communities that come out of something called the 4-H clubs, and then they move into that particular dynamic. But these are in communities, not necessarily in farming. The farming that you have today is more on par with the collective farms of Joe Stalin. Very, very large operations, whether they be traditional farms in places like Iowa or dairy farms like in Wisconsin, etc. The smaller farms are disappearing. Thus, what is happening is we are looking now at sustainable agriculture, which is a much smaller farms, 20 or 30 or less hectares or acres of land devoted to specific crops. And we have cooperative farms within cities, farm plants that are literally on rooftops, balconies, what have you. We even have what do we have? A tomato plant in a window. Anyway, neither here nor there on that particular situation. But let's get to it. We'll go to a source here, the Miami Herald. Also, we'll be looking at culture. Why are the wealthy wanting to get their offsprings into Ivy League schools? We'll be falling back upon an English professor emeritus from a university in San Obispo, California. They're taught in an agricultural country. Students would ask him, why are they studying the classics and how would that apply to them in real life? Let's go to the Herald. This was the question asked here. Can Trump win re-election without winning Florida? He's acting like it, according to this particular columnist here, David Smiley. Don't know who David Smiley is. David Smiley is not. But it seems less likely in 2020 that after Democrats rebound in the Rust Belt in November, Florida, on the other hand, was one of the few states that seemed immune to the 2018 blue wave, making it that much more important to DJ in 2020, plus the state and its diverse population of 22 million, very large state, seems as a bellwether for the rest of the nation. Not exactly. But anyway, let's get there. If we were to see something when Trump lost Florida, it would be an indication of a very bad night for him. That is from Rob Smith, Vice President of Strategy and Research at McLaughlin and Associates, which polls for the Trump campaign. It becomes a domino effect. Smith, who worked with the Republican Party of Florida and a pro-Trump super PAC, he's not privy to the internal Trump polling, but public polling and reports. Detailed internal polling suggests Trump is currently in a dogfight in Florida. I guess old H has been out literally putting up handbills. Contact University found in March 51% of the voters in the state definitely would not vote to re-elect DJ. The following month, the St. Leo University found that Trump's approval rating in the state was below 42. In mid-May at Florida Atlantic University, we've used that poll many times, found that the president was either in a tie or slightly ahead of a leading Democrat candidate in head-to-head matchup. There are potential cracks in the armor, namely in renewed push to drill off Florida's coast, even after the Trump administration decided the idea was off the table. That was in 2017. Democrats are also spending $4 million this year to organize and register 1 million Florida voters, and have tripled the size of their political staff from 2015. Strategists like Smith and Wills dismissed arguments that Florida has become a red state after decades of Republican control, noting that there were three statewide recounts in November, but after significantly outperforming Willard Romney in 2012. Tallies in 16. Trump now heads into 20 with perusing operation and a head full of steam. The cycle of the Republican National Committee is fully behind him, far out from Election Day, as the Republican Party of Florida now stocked with people who helped run the Trump campaign in the state. Florida is also led by some Trump's closest allies who were elected in November after the president spent the final week of the campaign holding rallies in Florida. Floridians have sent a clear message that they approve of Trump agenda when they elected, and this is Ron Santos and Rick Scott. That is from Keelan McEnany, the press secretary for Trump 2020. DeSantos' surprising victory in November could be among the most significant developments for the president. The former Freedom Caucus congressman is now widely shown by the polls to be popular with a strong majority of Florida voters. And along with Cruters, who pushed some of the president's top priorities, such as banning sanctuary cities and pushing to open up the pharmaceutical market with Canada. DeSantos wouldn't be governor were it not for the president of the United States weighing in and helping him. That is what Guffers said. I guess that's how you pronounce his name, Gruters. Would help push Trump's priorities this year in the Florida Senate. That's going to pay off a large dividends. Now DeSantos will deliver Florida for the president. For now, 18 months from election, Trump has an advantage, but it's debatable how much that head start will be worth when November 2020 rolls around. Very hard to say that. Steve Smith, a Democratic political strategist and poster, has led Barack Obama's. That was in 2008. Said Trump may be at an advantage of a percentage point. Well, percentage points themselves are very, very difficult to look at. It depends on a percentage point, but it doesn't really matter. You can have an advantage of a percentage point and win the election by 200 votes. Florida is a state that we are really not spending much time covering, and the reason for that is so corrupt. Voter suppression is at its highest in Florida. There's all sort of mischief going on there. We're not talking about so-called Russian interference. This is outright stealing of votes and blocking people from voting and amending or limiting the number of days that people can vote. It used to be called convenience voting. At one time, many of these states had absentee ballots. That's not the case anymore. So let's jump on here as we jumped in here to Biden. Biden's campaign of limited exposure, not very smart. How long can he keep it up? This is from the Washington Post. Annie Linsky here and Chesney James on the 26th. Bernie Sanders plans to enjoy ice cream in New Hampshire. Voters to celebrate Memorial Day. He will be far from a former Maryland Congressman Delaney. Another candidate, doesn't really matter where Delaney is. He's trying to run for something else. In Iowa, Cory Booker is riding around in an RV, while Kristen Gillibrand is unveiling a family bill of rights and touring an ethanol plant. That is in Iowa. And former VP Joe Lunchbox Biden's agenda for the holiday, according to his campaign. Joe has no publicly scheduled events. I suppose on the other side of the flip of the coin, and why would he? He's 15 points ahead. Everybody knows who Lunchbox is by now. Those 7 words are becoming familiar for Biden's team. Aside from the campaign's swing right after the announcement of his candidacy, Biden has kept his head down while the rivals are rushed from state to state to state. Even when he has public events, they include only a handful of questions from reporters. That is a mistake there. The light public schedule reflects the unique position of his campaign advisors say. After a near universal name recognition, high favorability ratings amongst Democrats, the former VP does not have to induce himself to vote. There's no doubt about that. As an early leader in the votes, he can attract media attention without splashy events. But there are risks. Voters in early primary states, especially in Iowa, with his caucus system that rewards the ground organizing, what's called retail politics, want to see the candidates personally, and often there's a danger with Biden's schedule and reinforces a word President DJ Trump using called Sleepy Joe. Well, I guess we can go to Senator Roberts of Kansas, who is retiring, but after some campaigning that he had not done in many years, said he had to go and rest up. He did rest up and won re-election, so that doesn't mean anything. Biden campaign says that's not going to happen. I have zero worries that any voter will leave Joe's events with doubt about his energy. That is from Kate Benningfield, his deputy campaign manager. Biden spends 30 minutes to an hour greeting voters on a rope line after his public events. No doubt. But again, this is a person that has ran before for president. Not only that, he was for 8 years VP under Barack Obama, and he was out and about. His other duty was to be attack dogs, so watch out for him. The first Democratic debate, that'll be on the 26th and 27th of June. Biden will share the stage with 9 rivals, a moderator eager to press him on positions and his record. Other debates follow where influential groups ranging from labor unions to various organizations out there. Biden won't be seen in very many of those either. Some Democratic strategists say Biden may be limiting his participation in freewheeling sessions, partly to play down the fact that he is older than the figures they may remember. I doubt that very seriously, too. Everybody knows how old he is. She said Biden is benefiting from his association, no doubt, with President Barack Obama. The people have seen him live in 2017, and the more they realize he might not be the guy they remembered in 2008. Well, that was 10 years ago, no doubt about it. Since entering the race, he's held 11 public events, according to his campaign. Former Beto, nearly 4 times that number in the same period, according to the scheduled Gillibrand, who lags in the polls, plans 11 stops in Iowa. She needs to. Elizabeth Warren is faring much better. Shows her face to the public at 27 events in 4 weeks. Biden in the race. Booker has 27 events scheduled, same time span. And Bernie Sanders, who also had very good name recognition, 17 events. It's not so much how many events you have, it's the type of ground organization, particularly in a place like Iowa, that you have. But Biden doesn't have to worry about that because he has the quote-unquote political machine in Iowa is already out there. Move On. That's an activist group. We're a member of that. Is not coming to their big ideas forum next week in San Francisco, which features 8 of the candidates. And in the California Democratic Party convention, he's going to be a no-show there. I guess he'll concede that to Kamala Harris. 17 candidates say they are coming. The Democratic Party's dinner, that's in Iowa, not Biden. The Black Economic Alliance, the presidential forum, that's in Charlotte, in South Carolina, will which sent out 7 invitations, indicate that he no indication he plans to take part. Doesn't really need to. And that's the different kind of campaign where Lunchbox will start getting in trouble as the campaign continues along. The upside for front runners, they are always going to be covered. That's from Robbie Mock, who was Hillary Clinton's disgraced campaign manager. My words, not the post. The curse of always being covered is not always what you want to be about. In such case, like I said, the coverage tends to have processes about process and how well the candidate is doing in the polling. It can be tricky to stay focused on what you want to talk about. I doubt that Joe Biden knows how to talk. Some of this is kind of interesting, but not that interesting, period. You have not seen Joe Biden yet. He has lots of history here. That's from Sarah Muller, chair of the Waha County Democrats in Nevada. A lot of us have pictures with him and some stories with him. Well, Dan Balls wrote this article. Oh, wait a minute. Dan Balls, contributed to it. Dan Ball's been around a very long time himself. Let me see if I'll finish up here. Rolling Thunder. This is from Reuters. This will be, on Memorial Day will be their last ride. It's a veterans advocacy group founded in the Reagan era by a 73-year-old Vietnam vet named Archie. It got its name from a 1965 bombing campaign against Vietnam dubbed Operation Rolling Thunder. Anyway, these characters rolled in on a bunch of cycles for 30 years. One of the reasons they're not rolling anymore, that was 30 years ago. And it's gotten to be that they're out of date. Many things are changing. Thus, the cost of literally going to Washington, permits, etc., they're going to more north, south, Midwest, regional. I guess old Archie's still alive. Regional events. A lot of organizations have done that, particularly on the left. They have moved to those. Let's move on, and we'll come back to education. We'll move to Charlie Cook. Mr. Cook is writing. We'll find Mr. Cook. Where is Mr. Cook? It'll take us a little while to find Mr. Cook. He's writing anyway on the 24th of May, 2019. For the better part of this decade, for instance, if you asked me about the chances of a Republican losing their majority in the House, my response would have been not much. In 2011, Republicans redrew congressional maps in 16 states with 199 congressional districts, not even remotely offset by Democratic gerrymandering in 4 states with 40 there. Let me get the rest of his article up here. Not cooperating with me here for some very, very strange reading. Here we go. Anyway, the rest of Charlie's article. That's exactly what their very unpopular president managed to deliver. That's in 2018. The worst years circumstances have indeed changed. Similarly, the Senate should be reasonably safe for Republicans in 2020. And there are 22 seats up for grabs compared to 12 for the Democrats. None of them behind, quote-unquote, the enemy lines of blue states. Not a single Republican seat in 2020 is nearly as endangered as 5 Democratic seats last year. Susan Collins up for re-election in Maine and should be defeated there. That's a state that Hillary won by 3 percentage points. And Cory Gardner should be voted out in Colorado. That's a state that Clinton carried by 4.9 votes. But these are hardly vertical clips. 4 more Republicans in states. Trump won by single digits. That is Arizona. Arizona is much more promising. There's a lot of voter suppression in Georgia and North Carolina. And Texas, well, it would depend on who was running in Texas. Put it this way, no Republican senator in the same hemisphere of vulnerability as Doug Jones in Alabama. No doubt about that. He won't have Roy Moore this time to kick around. Maybe not, though. Now allegations of Moore's interest in underage girls is old news. It is questionable whether a presidential year Jones could ever beat him. Well, that's probably true. Old Judge Moore has had a lot of staying power there. Democratic majorities may come straight out of the suburbs around Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, and they do. Kansas City, Oklahoma City, along with 4 districts in Orange County, California, and elsewhere. Many of these gains came not from career politicians moving up traditional ladders of elected office, but from outsiders with 10 coming out of either military intelligence backgrounds, like Abigail Strandberger out of Virginia. She was a CIA analyst. Unencumbered by much of the ideological baggage and voting records that kept Democrats from winning in recent years, decades in much of the South and borderline states. But as bad news as it was last year in suburban districts for the GOP, there's still more that they could lose, perhaps if a better Democratic challenge is in place or the seat becomes open. Republican-controlled states enacted laws that effectively ban abortions, threatened to make a bad situation worse for Republicans. It is not to make a moral, ethical, or legal statement, just a political statement. A third of the electorate at most supports the measure this aggressively. It has been said that Americans are anti-abortion and pro-choice. Most don't like the idea of abortion. Many believe that there should be some limits, are extremely uncomfortable with late-term abortions. There are not very many late-term abortions in the first place. And let me finish up Charlie here. There was a time when the decision to set up a court test for abortion laws were made carefully by anti-abortion lawyers and strategists on the national level, picking cases very carefully to maximize their chances of victory. Today's decision-making on both decentralized and organic, apparently by tone-deaf people who seem too obvious of the consequences of their course. Oblivious, I'm sorry. When Pat Robinson thinks the anti-abortion measure goes too far, there is a fair chance it's too far. This isn't a pro-choice bone in Robinson. There is not in his body, but the Yale High School... Start over again. The Yale Law School class of 1955. Graduate knows a bad case when he sees one. I didn't know that Pat Robinson was also a lawyer. He's been preaching forever. Anyway, it's this is all a long ways of saying that while Republican majorities in the Senate probably shouldn't be in much danger, if one were going to construct a scenario in which the Democrats reached a 50-seat majority with a White House win, 51 without it, and uncompromising assault on legal abortion would likely be an element. It will be in some states, but in states like Alabama, no effect at all, and Mississippi and some of those other states. In Maine, it could send Colin to the shower for good. In Colorado, and in any state that it's a very tight race and suburban women, educated women, come out in a great force. Now let me finish this up here. I believe this is Amy Walter. Democrats and the enthusiasm gap. Democrats are sometimes a catch-22. There is a consensus, at least among the chattering class, of highly engaged Democratic voters, that the party needs to pick up a nominee who is the most electable, even if the person is not the most exciting or groundbreaking pick, i.e. a European moderate male, but the less risky candidates risk depressing the Democratic base vote, especially young people and voters of color. The very Democratic votes that needs to turn out to beat Trump. New polling, this is from Pew. Pew is one of the so-called nonpartisan ones, fairly accurate, suggests that Joe Lunchbox Biden, the candidate seen as most electable, also fits the description of typical nominee that many voters in the Democratic Party base say they are less enthusiastic about. Pew asked Democratic voters to choose their level of enthusiasm for the Democratic nominee. A candidate who was female, African American, Latino generated the most enthusiasm. A candidate who was described as gay, lesbian, and bisexual drew slightly more eagerness than weariness, 17% more enthusiasm, 15% less enthusiasm. Oh well. I guess they're talking about what's his name there? Alfred B. Newman out of South Bend. Anyway, the characteristics that drew the lowest, percentage of and the highest percentage of apathy, you guessed it, a European male. Well, that's not going to matter. They'll go with whatever is on the plate. That's the conventional wisdom, and we would follow that. Also, just 4% of Democrats say they would be more enthusiastic if the nominee for president were a European male. That will depend. They have to look at the other European male that would be on the ticket, one DJ Trump. The level of awareness for a European male candidate is more pronounced amongst young women. That's 18 to 49. 26% of those women said they would be less enthusiastic. Well, being less enthusiastic would not mean they would not vote. That is a bit higher of the 18 to 49-year-olds. Over 20%, 22% of whom say they would be less enthusiastic about a Democratic voter that standard bearer that happens to be a European male. And these young women are also the most enthusiastic about the prospects of the nominee of any other group. 45%, 18 to 49, say they would be enthusiastic about a female candidate. Latino voters are more equally enthusiastic about the prospects of a Latino nominee. They probably won't see that one. Anyway, let's go to a little bit of academia here. We've always liked academia. Hung around universities for a long time. This is from the Washington Post. The liberal arts are under attack. So why do the rich want their children to study them? Because they have some sense. Anyway, this is by Valerie Strauss. A new analysis by two economists takes issue with those who argue that liberal arts education is not worth the investment. This is Catherine Hall and Elizabeth Davidson of the Andrew Mellon Foundation. Look at how much graduates with liberal arts education can earn. They found that while liberal arts education majors may not earn as much as engineers, they do well. And that definitely has shifted in recent years, that people are looking more for generalists there. Brings us to the post below us, written by Donald Lazare, Professor Emeritus of English at California Polytechnic State University, that's San Luis Obispo, who asked the question, who was asked and answered the question following if a liberal arts education isn't worth much money, as critics contend, why do the United States' wealthiest families want their children to get one? He is a co-author with Anne-Marie Wormack, the third edition of Reading and Writing for Civil Literacy, the Critical Citizen's Guide to Argumentative Rhetoric, forthcoming from Routledge. He is also the author of Political Literacy in Composition and Rhetoric, the unique critique of Albert Camus, and the editor of the American Media and Mass Culture Left Perspective. This is by Mr. Lazare. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Recent scandal of wealthy parents bribing their way into Ivy League level universities intensified a long-standing the curriculum anomaly. The curriculum of most selective and expensive private undergraduate colleges has always and certainly been liberal arts, yet little of the public attention has been paid to what's in the curriculum, has made it so desirable by children of the wealthy or those aspiring to be wealthy. Those who ridicule a liberal arts education love to focus on bizarrely titled and narrowly specialized college courses in literary philosophical studies or doctorate-sounding subjects as identity politics. The accuracy of such accounts is often disputable, but to whatever extent they may be accurate, I would agree that these courses often abandon the most important mission of liberal education, that is to embody what the sociologist Alvin Geithner termed cultural critical discourse. This is the common language of Bachelor of Arts students, faculty, and graduates, whatever their class, ethnic, or gender identities may be. What constitutes that culture? One is rooted in the philosophy of Socrates, recanted in Plato's The Apology, urging his students to question both the established authority and their own beliefs. To know thyself, become an unexamined life is not worth living, one of many contemporary reapplications of Socrates' questioning is the philosopher Martha Nussbaum's book, Not for Profit, Why Society Needs. This is we did a show, incidentally, on the pinheads. That was one of the situations there that most people, there are many people out there that believe education in itself is a waste of time. I'm not talking about liberal arts and say, well, yeah, I remember a lady telling me that a neighbor, working class type, felt that education was the path. All of his children went to college or university, and they did well. Whereas her children also went to some college, not perhaps finishing. I don't remember the whole family history there, but they discounted education. And part of that is that in this particular generation, people saw at that time the threshold high school. Well, that would work in the 50s and in the 60s. You could emerge in a job, even in a so-called middle strata job. Many people with high school or perhaps some type of technical school education or on-job education could advance and get into what we would term a white-collar job. But that in itself was not the general rule. I can recall there was a time that, and this was out of the 60s and 70s, when universities were accessible and they were also financially accessible. The cost was not prohibitive. Many universities, including Harvard, had an open door policy. You could just simply walk across Constitutional Avenue and walk in. And if your grades were adequate, you could stick around there and graduate. But nonetheless, you'd be exposed to the educational opportunities. And many of us had basically the same type of policy. The state universities were much more accessible. In places like New York, California, etc., you could start, if you wished, at the community, a small college level close to home. People could live with their parents in some cases, but those were extreme cases. Rents were much more affordable in those days, so people could go off to school or take a job or whatever and matriculate. Anyway, in fact, such a policy was advocated in 2010 by much maligned Common Core State Standards Initiative that was commissioned by the National Governors Association, advocating nationwide instruction in K through 12 to demonstrate the cogent reasoning and use of evidence that is essential to the responsible citizen in a democratic republic. Perhaps the wisest view on that issue was Thomas Jefferson's letter to John Adams, titled The National Aristocrat, in which Jefferson described a model that he devised, but that was never implemented nationally, for making a free quality education through university level accessible to all social classes at the public expense, i.e. funded. Worth and genius would thus have been sought out for every condition of life, completely prepared by education for defending the completion of wealth and a birth for the public trust. And that was the general idea here: raise the masses of people to higher ground of moral respectability necessary to their own safety and to orderly government, would have completed the great objective of qualifying them to elect the venerable Estra, or meritocracy for trusts of government, to the exclusion of those born to wealth and power. Prejudice. Anyway, content of this education, Jefferson included a letter to his nephew, Peter Carr, on his studies, questioning without boldness ever existence of God, because there is one. He might He must more approve of the homage of reasoning than of blindfold fear. Well, this is one of the things that a good education brings out there. Liberal bias or relativism in today's higher education is precisely the tradition of skeptical and critical discourse from Plato to Jefferson and of American founders. That was in the 19th century, age of reason. Both educated liberals and conservatives should cherish the liberal arts education cultural elite as our society's Socratic gadfly. Okay, let me just finish this up here. To Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American scholar sound like his European counterpart, Karl Marx. Young men of the fairest promise are hidden from the action by a disgust which principle on which business is managed, inspired and turned. Doldrums are die of disgust in some of their suicide. On to Emerson's disciple, Henry David Thoreau, which I read, and they were both graduates of Harvard, and concurred in his essay, Life Without Principle, the way by which you get money almost without exception lends downward. And there is nothing, not even a crime. There is the more opposed to poetry, to philosophy, to life itself than the incessant business. And Mark Twain talked about the guilty age there, etc. So let me finish up the good professor's situation here. Finally, it's just a liberal education for anyone except the rich is that enlightened many graduates of and facilities of the most selective liberal arts colleges have long been distinguished not by the wealth of their predominance as scholars and practitioners in fields like the pure and social sciences, arts, humanities, as authorities on a public affair, public intellectuals. That's where many of the people that work in the space we're in, public intellectuals, talking heads, are activists for social justice, going back to the abolitionists, the feminists, and we talked about the Statue of Liberty as a statute for the abolitionists. Well, we go back a long time. Those Emerson and company were at one time the quote-unquote talking heads. We keep talking. I've discovered in some of my academic travels that people at universities resent the so-called public intellectuals. Well, because the public intellectuals, and I'm thinking of the professor that wrote Capitalism, the French professor there, Petit, and his Capitalism, a public intellectual. Well, the situation is in social media. There are many people out there that are on YouTube or whatever and have 250,000, a million followers, and they produce prodigiously. Now, some their own writings, like Petit, I think his name is Dr. Thomas Petit. Anyway, and others that, like ourselves, that thrive on the works of others and present it and provide some analysis. I've always had a qualm about a public intellectual and what the intellectual means. We don't want to, as they say, be operating on the fraud. Let me get to this one here. Hopefully I can find it. Yeah. This is exploring the past of the new farmers of America and the merger with the FAA. New Farmers of America was an African American organization. This paper explores the Pass of the New Farmers of America, that is the NFA, merges with the FFA, identifies a rationale that existed in the 60s, and I'm just reading from it, which may lead to the merger of the New Farmers of America and it was at the time the Future Farmers of America. It includes memos presented from the archives referencing the controversy surrounding the merger immediately before and after in 1965. The paper is divided into section example of pertinent information found in the archives surrounding the merger. The FAA was a thriving organization for African American males prior to the merger in 1965. It had about 58,000 members, but since that time the total membership for African Americans in the so-called FAA has declined by over 38,000. Focusing on diversity is a major issue in today's society. Looking back at the past is one way of determining what may have led to the decline of African American students in agriculture. Background information is presented referring to the general history of the NFA and everyday activities of the organization, which included the aims and purposes of the organization in the early 60s, representing the NFA and FFA met to discuss a merger, but it was a forced marriage, one would say. And a question here was like with Major League Baseball, the intent of the infrastructure of the FAA, much of the program being made after the merger, but the question of fair treatment of the NFA's supervisors was continuously presented due to the non-existence of African Americans in supervisory roles that would be akin to the owners of African American baseball teams during the Negro Leagues about the same time. However, the number of African American males in 1965 exceeded the number of African American males and females in the FAA body today, no doubt about that. So those are some of the things here. Perhaps we'll get to turn this into a program. The paper is exploring the past of the New Farmers of America, that's the NFA, and the merger with the FAA. Identifies a rationale extended in the 60s. It also includes, and this is, I don't want to go over this, but some of the background information here. It's well documented, and the New Farmers of America was a national organization of Negro farm boys studying vocational agriculture in public schools throughout the U.S. Its purpose was the development of its members in a vocational, social, and recreational life through its members. There are 58,000 of them active members at the height. That was in 1963. And the FAA the NFA were approximately, okay. The FFA at that time had 454,000 members, and today there are approximately 20,000 active African American members in the FAA, and that was long. There's probably far less today. Anyway, this was spearheaded by an article by an educator in Minnesota that we came about. We'll probably have to turn this into a special program. Anyway, let us move on here. Let's check the time here. Running a little close on our time. We'll have to get back to hockey. Anyway, the 2019 NCAA softball tournament, Florida finally grabs a spot, a win over Tennessee. This is a women's championship here. The Gators defeat, that's the SEC rival Tennessee, 2-1 in Gainesville, of all places. And if we start looking at the schedule here, game 1 of Florida, let's see, 3-1 over Tennessee. And this was on Friday, and on Saturday, game 2, Tennessee 3-2 over Florida, and game 3, Florida 2-1 over Tennessee. Minnesota also got into the act. The Minnesota Gophers made the most of their first time hosting a super regional, beating LSU 3-0 on a Saturday for a 2-game sweep to earn the first trip to the Women's College World Series. So in Game 1, it was Minnesota 7-5 over. It was Minnesota 5-3 over LSU. Game 2, Minnesota shut out LSU. And we go to Washington, Game 2 in Seattle, Super Region there. 1 point, and let's see here. The way the game went, Kentucky probably wished the postponement had held there. Anyway, nonetheless, the Huskies were there, and in Game 1, Washington 3, they shut out Kentucky. In Game 2 on Saturday, Washington 5-0, they shut them out again. Arizona is on its way to OKC, and that schedule there was Arizona 5-2 over Ole Miss. That was on Friday, and Arizona 6-1 over Ole Miss. That was the end of that situation. And Alabama routes Texas. Alabama 3-0, they shut Texas out. And Alabama 7-5 in. It was on Thursday, 7-5 on Friday, and finally 8-5 there. And those are the scores. Let's go to baseball. Toronto 10-1 over the Padres. That was in Toronto. The Mets 4-3 over the Tigers. Rays 6-3 over Cleveland. The Nationals 9-6, high scoring game there over the Marlins in D.C. The Dodgers 11-7 over the Pirates in Pittsburgh. The Red Sox 4-1 over the Astros in Texas. That's not an easy feat there. Mr. Rodriguez won the game. Van Linder was a loser. Anyway, the Brewers 9-1 over the Phillies in Milwaukee. The Twins shut out the White Sox in Minnesota. A game we tuned into, the Royals 8-7 over the Yankees, and in 10. The Reds 10-2 over our Cubbies. Boy, the Cubbies have been losing lately. I don't know what's going on there. Anyway, the Rockies 8-7 over the Orioles, and the D-backs 6-2 over the Giants. Giants will be in themselves. The Angels 7-6 over the Rangers in Los Angeles. The Athletics were in Oakland 7-1 over the Mariners, and in 10, another game we tuned into. The Cards lost the game. Anyway, it ended up Atlanta 4-3 over the Cardinals. And so we go. We'll try to do a little something here on soccer. Sporting Kansas City 3-2 over Seattle Sounders. And the San Jose Earthquakes 2-1 over the Toronto F. Lesno over Tonino. Tonino 3-1 there. And Roma 2-1 over Parma. Atlantic 3-1 over Sassuolo. Anyway, messed it up. Mozambique. Namibia 2-1 over Mozambique. We're turning around there. Maui 3-1 there over whoever they are. The U.S. This is the women's team international league. 3-1 or 3-0 over Mexico. Now they're all around. Chinese Super League. Oh boy. Shanghai and De Lima 1-0 over Shanghai. Shizang was shut out. Zhanghong 1-0. Another Zhanghong team. And on this one, Shandong 3-1 over them, and Shanghai 2-1 over Beijing. I was glad to get out of that one. Anyway, we'll have to get it from the BBC on these soccer teams. This will do it for us on the Monday morning quarterback. I think we covered everyone. This is Boston Red and Jerry Pippin broadcast booth. Have a happy Memorial Day weekend. We'll talk to you soon. We'll come in with an open source report, and maybe if we have we'll come up with the Australian elections. The reason for that is the Australian election set the stage of many things. We'll talk about that. And in the European elections, of which the tallies are coming in, right-wing parties in France and Italy. Le Pen's party beat out Macron's party in France by, 1 or 2 seats, something like that. And the Greens did very well in Germany. Perhaps on BR on the World tomorrow, if we have time, we'll bring in some of these. We've been a little bit behind on some of the international stories, but are very important. The connections between Le Pen's party, as they changed their name, and a loan from a Russian bank, and the whole idea of these so-called right-wing populist movements. What we're trying to do when we talk about those is coordinate them or correlate them with America First in the U.S. and try to predict where they are going. Good day, or not going.